Well, thank you for joining the Partnership for Public Service at our first Author Talks event. My name is Emma Shirato Ullman. I am an associate manager at the partnership, and I have the immense pleasure to welcome our speakers, Tara Dawson Mcginnis and Hannah Schenk, the authors of Power to the Public. Before properly introducing them, just a few housekeeping notes. We invite you to use the Zoom chat function to communicate with panelists and audience members, but please use the Q&A feature to submit a question for the open portion of the event. And now, introducing our first speaker, Tara Dawson Mcginnis, founded the New Practice Lab at New America, where she takes a people-centered and hands-on approach to improve policies focused on family economic security. She also teaches public policy at Georgetown University. And before joining New America, Tara advised and directed key White House initiatives, including the Task Force on Community Solutions and the rollout of healthcare.gov. Hannah Schenk, our second speaker, is a founding member and senior advisor for the Public Interest Technology Program at New America, developing the field through research, storytelling, and fostering crucial connections. She was one of the early members of the U.S. Digital Service, where she served as a director of the Department of Homeland Security, and also brings a private sector perspective, having founded and ran a user experience consultancy. Their book, Power to the Public, released earlier this year, weaves narratives of people from diverse sectors and issue areas working to solve critical problems with principles of strong design, data, and delivery to form the tapestry that is public interest technology. Here to moderate a discussion on the book and the field in general is Mark Lerner, who leads the partnership's federal technology strategy and programs. He has served in private, public, and academic positions, including a stint in the U.S. Digital Service as well, and as a New America Fellow, where he worked closely alongside Tara and Hannah. I'll pass it over to Mark now.
Turns out that I was muted. Thank you so much for the introduction, Emma. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And thanks for joining us. Hannah, Tara, so good to have you here. So good to have this conversation with you all. Power to the Public has been one of my favorite books. It's the first book that I recommend to people when I say you need to get into this field, you need to understand what's going on in what we're doing. And when I thought about, who better to sort of introduce the partnership's own audience to rather than the two of you. So really excited to have this conversation. I thought I'd kick us off with a question just about the history of the book a little bit and how you all came up with the idea of wanting to write a book on it. I know that the two of you have been working in this space for a while, but what was the first sort of impetus for actually writing the book in the first place? And maybe Tara, we'll start with you and then go to Hannah.
Sure. I think we thought that there was all this amazing work happening that wasn't so visible, that it wasn't clear that it was a field, and that we really wanted to make it a thing, make it visible, and pull together these threads that we could see. I left the federal government in 2016, and I just kept walking around thinking the most important things that we did in the Obama administration wasn't the what of our work, but the how. And I really went on a bit of a walkabout interviewing people about where you learn how to make the government work in the digital age. Part of that became the class I teach at Georgetown, but part of that ended up in the partnership I have with Hannah in writing the book.
Great.
And on my end, so I spent a year at the United States Digital Service, and I came out of that experience feeling like, so first of all, I came out of that experience feeling like I'm never going back to the private sector. This is my way forward. But I also came out of it thinking that was one way to do things, and I wonder what else people are doing. And so I also ended up kind of doing a walkabout through sort of the what was being called civic tech space and innovation teams. And, when you start to do research, you start to see patterns. And I think that Tara and I connected on the book in part because we came from totally opposite directions and sort of met in the middle. So I had this private sector tech person career, and Tara had a public sector policy person career. And here we were actually, uniting on a thing that we saw happening around us, and felt that it was really important to put a stake in the ground and say, this is not just a random amalgamation of people who happen to all hit on the same viewpoint. It is actually a field, and it has its own way of thinking and methodologies, and here it is.
Great, that's great. I love knowing it's coming from two different places that collect in the center, and knowing that it's about the how that we're doing it. Now, in that particular element, so the book touches on this topic of public problem solving, which something both of you have a lot of experience with, that you've worked on quite a bit, including other published works. And for folks that might have only ever been on one side or the other of the public-private divide, and they think of this term public problem solving, what makes solving problems in the public space from this perspective of in the digital era different than how one might do this in the private sector? And I'll go in reverse order. Hannah, we'll start with you.
Unmute. Yes, I think this is a great question. And I was thinking about it earlier today, that to some extent, coming from the private sector into the public sector is a little bit like being asked to do your job with like both hands tied behind your back and bad internet connectivity, in a way. But there's one piece of it where whatever you want to do whatever you want to do to solve a problem, it's going to be 1,000 times harder in the public sector. Yes, because of bureaucracy. Yes, because of procurement. Yes, because of incentive structures, but also because of laws, which are meant to protect us. And also because whatever you're building in the public sector, you don't get to say, we're not going to deal with this audience. In the private sector, everything is about, we have this very small group of people and we want them to do this thing, which ultimately results in a purchase, in making money for our company. And in the public sector, the problems are so phenomenally more complex and layered, and your user group is everyone. So when you start to solve a tech problem in the private sector, your very first thing is, well, who is our user group? And then we don't have to worry about anybody else. No one gets to say that in the public sector. That's not an option. So simply that fact, I think, makes public sector problem solving phenomenally more complex. Tara, I'm sure you have thoughts.
I think the only piece I would add is I think it's hard to see until you're in a state or federal government the kind of architectural differences. Like, oh hey, we want to do this thing. How much money do we have? We don't know. We have to go ask those guys and gals who are overlords in our state legislature. The kind of leadership structure that really allows you not to totally own the budget or totally own the rules or the timing is really different. And I think some of that shows up in a number of different ways in how things are challenging. On the flip side, I do think, and you probably heard this in Hannah and maybe Mark, a number of people who have been in and out of the private sector and joined the public sector see the scale, like 1 million people today helped, and the scale is really the type of scale of good, especially at the federal level, that it's hard to go back to like, I'm going to help 12 people today when you're working at this kind of for the country operation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. The notion that you can't pick your audience, that you can't pick your users, and you really are, especially at the federal level, but also state and local, you're dealing with everybody. I'll never forget one of the people that I managed to wring away from the private sector and get to work at the San Francisco Digital Service. They have so much pride walking out of their door. They live in San Francisco, and knowing everyone that is around them is someone that they are helping every single day. And it's something that's truly, truly just totally different. Now,
and
go ahead.
But to add to that, and addictive. I mean, that's something that like, you don't get that. You don't get that feeling of like, wow, I did a thing that like, even if I did one tiny, tiny, tiny thing, it still helped millions and millions of people. And that is just something like, even if, thinking back to like in the private sector, who my user group would be like runners, or like people who like to hike, or people who want to, buy a whatever, lipstick. Like, even if you're reaching every single lipstick user, it's still not the same as like, okay, so all Americans, whatever.
Right. And the aspect of it just being so much harder to actually get things done, it actually reminds me, Hannah, of one of the stories that you tell of changing a line on a website, where in the private sector, it would be, a simple, commit code change. And in the public sector, there are, again, a lot of rules and regulations and laws meant to protect us, but it is a huge challenge. Now, one of the things that I want to touch on is, the book, Power to the Public, Promise of Public Interest Technology. It can be easy for people to sort of see technology there and immediately think, okay, tech, this is what it's about, technology. And actually, I want to highlight one of the questions that a member of our book club, the partnership's own book club, had, which is, and I'll quote from them, one point that I've been thinking a lot about since reading is how little of this is really tied to technology, despite the name. In some ways, technology is being used as a kind of good Trojan horse to sneak into much needed structural changes. Are there risks, though, in not being more straightforward and clear with the criticisms of exactly what is broken and what needs to be done differently? Tara?
Yes. I mean, this is back, the level of reward is matched by the level of risk, right? In the, even just some of the core fundamentals on how you would roll out development in the private sector small before going big, meet the barrier of we can't offer something to someone that we don't offer to everyone. But boy, doesn't it seem risky to just roll healthcare.gov out to all of America? Not to speak from one particular painful experience that produced like every white hair on my head. It seems risky in some ways to do things different. And what we find in a lot of our work at the state level, and Marina Nietzsche and her work on child welfare, is like, it's super easy to get 5 states once you get one, but the first one and the level of effort to try something new is tremendously harder. And in thinking about the risk, and I may be particularly influenced because I just went over the past week to visit one of the organizations we talk about in the book based in Detroit, Michigan, Sevilla. And the CEO of Sevilla, Michael Brennan, who has kind of an amazing story of working his whole life in the public sector at the United Way and saying, like, we're not going to get things done differently without doing things differently, and quits, works out of a closet unpaid on a design project to improve the longest benefit application in the entire country. And so Michigan, millions of Americans in Michigan had this front door of everything from energy benefits to emergency housing to emergency cash or SNAP. It was a 42-page process. You could, Michael used to tie the pages of the application together end to end, and they roll out like 50 feet. And the Sevilla team did interviews with frontline workers and beneficiaries and really mapped the journey of what it was like and created ostensibly a museum of the experience of Michigan state frontline workers and the folks that they were serving. And it's kind of an amazing story. They invited 4 senior officials to their office, folks will know this read the book, for a briefing, and they just reenacted what it was like to walk into a benefits office. And they had an awkward 11 minutes of silence. They handed them the forms. These are super senior officials who report to the governor. And they just then walk them through a museum of the words of your frontline workers and the words of how lost people receiving help from you feel. And after this experience, like on the spot, they had commitment to do a really hard transformation project, but because you can't unsee what has been seen. And so I think one way to mitigate the risk is to change the context for leaders in a way that then makes it seem risky to proceed apace, helping people in a way that feels dehumanizing.
Huge.
Oh, and I'll add on to that it's a great question. In the book, we talk in many ways, and that story is a great example, and can also tell the Rhode Island story, which I will tell in a second. We have a number of stories in the book where technology is sort of the secret Trojan horse of like, we're going to modernize your stuff, but we're not going to tell you. We're going to actually talk about the other thing. I think that there may be a window of time where like that approach is necessary. And let's hope we're maybe getting to the end of that, where we can actually really just talk about technology as the means for delivering your policy. Because the reality is that, and Tara and I are both involved in projects where there have been major delivery issues on a national policy. We know that these are just going to keep piling up because there isn't really such a thing as delivery that doesn't involve technology at this point. And technology is, I think the Trojan horse approach was something that was 100% needed at a time when technology wasn't completely integrated in every aspect of our life. That's changed. And I think that it's fair to say that that's, the world changes fast these days. And that's changed even, that change has been happening since we started writing the book and is continuing. So that, we're probably even farther into tech being in every aspect of our lives than we were a year ago when we were writing the book. The story that this calls to mind is one of our favorite stories. It's Marina Nietzsche, who Tara mentioned. She was previously the CTO at the Veterans Administration, and but she'd always been involved in foster care. She'd been, as a college student, she'd volunteered as a foster parent and for the foster care system, and it was a personal passion of hers. So she had agreed to work with the state of Rhode Island. So Rhode Island came to her because they needed to procure a new system for foster care. And she was like, wait a minute, let's back up. And the larger problem that Rhode Island was trying to solve was not that they needed to procure a new system. It was that 2/3 of kids in foster care in Rhode Island were going straight into group homes instead of with foster parents. And it's very well known that outcomes are significantly better when kids are placed with foster families. So this was 2017, 2/3 of kids going straight into group homes, which is the 4th highest rate in the nation. So Rhode Island thought, oh, there aren't enough people, and also we can't see where the people are because we don't have the right system. And Marina led a team that took a deep look at what the actual problem was. And the problem was not that there weren't enough families to serve as foster parents. In fact, the state was overwhelmed with so many applications for foster parents that only 17% of the applicants had a license a year and a half after applying. And one of the other differences between the private sector and the public sector is there's a lot of crisis and a lot of things that have to happen immediately in the public sector. That doesn't happen in the same way in the private sector. Like, yes, okay, in the private sector, you're rolling out a new product and everybody has that date circled on their calendar. But it's not like people aren't going to eat or be clothed or have a house to go to. So this was a crisis. And in working to streamline the process, Marina's team noticed that a form to consent to contact an applicant's doctor was on a separate page from the rest of the foster parent application. So what the team did to solve this massive problem, are you ready? They added a staple. And the rate of failure went from 70% on that form to 0. And this, of course, is one very small drop in a much longer story. But I think when we talk about technology being the Trojan horse, that was not a technology problem. That was a problem that someone just needed to look at the form and be like, oh, no one's turning these in together. How about a staple? They are now to the procurement piece of this project in a much better place where they were before, because they have a real understanding of what the problems are that they're trying to solve. Obviously, the problem is not a lack of staples. The problem is not a lack of parents. The problem was much deeper.
I keep coming back to this idea of one of the core elements of the public interest tech movement as a whole, again, has nothing to do with technology, but rather is about problem identification and actually digging into, can you state the problem and then double check, triple check, quadruple check, like, is that actually the right problem? Can we keep going back to that? And I love the notion here that, some people might accept, like, well, we know that the problem is just there's not enough families, there's not enough parents, but turns out that, as Lauren mentioned, for want of staple. I want to remind folks in the audience, as we're going through this conversation, please feel free to add in questions into the Q&A. We are more than happy to take those in. So as you start thinking up your own things, just go ahead and drop them in there. Now, I want to selfishly talk about one of my favorite quotes in the book, which is your biggest policy achievements, speaking about leaders in government, your biggest policy achievements rely entirely on your agency's ability to deliver them to the public, right? And it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about in the entire space, which is actually delivering to the public and the services we provide them, and delivery being the most important part of anything that government does. One of the things that I would often say when I was back in government at USCIS is that the written policy matters very little compared to what the actual system and what the actual process is, right? What's on the actual paper form is more important than what actually is written in some policy somewhere. Now, your book came out right around the start of the Biden administration. I think it was March of this year. And I'm curious from your perspective, especially from the perspective of that you have given your roles at New America, if the lessons from this element, that the delivery matters more than the written policy, is something that you feel the administration has bought into enough, or if there are potential gaps that might still need to be bridged given this new wave of leaders coming into government. Maybe I'll start with Tara on that one.
Sure. I think head and shoulders, the team in the transition, this is what I speak to most closely, it's the first agency review team that ever had a delivery leader on every domestic, agency. We inside the policy team had embedded in the policy team leaders who were former USGSers or were coming from state and local government on the delivery side. So, the steps, there are clear steps to kind of bridge this design and delivery for sure, that were not even imagined, I think, by any, as a person serving in Obama administration, we came to in the out years. On the other hand, so yes, tons of progress, but also the scale of what this means on a daily basis, especially as we approach potentially the passage of, in the American Rescue Plan, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and now here imminently potentially on Build Back Better. There's a transformation project inside the IRS that is an $80 billion transformation project that will either fundamentally improve or bring to a crashing halt the ability to file your taxes. That's no, did anyone here in the audience read about that in what's in Build Back Better? The number of enormous, critically important, but not even on the main to-do list projects, and just how hard the deck is stacked against that going well, I think means that you need to be vigilant and really attentive to this. And so I think we have a lot more going in the architecture of the federal government than before. But again, so much of what the success is relies on states having kind of the sophistication of a H&F for U.S. Social Services. And I don't think we're quite there yet.
I'd actually love to dig in on that point, in particular, the state level element of it, because it's something that I've noticed a lot over the last year or 2 years, is that we're really starting to see a lot of people in this field, the public interest tech field, again, realizing, oh, we really have to focus on that state level and the local level. Have you found that the lessons that we've learned from doing this work at that federal scale sort of transfer down? And likewise, I know that you did a lot of work at the state level. Do the ways of working at that level transfer up similarly? Either of you can take it.
I think that we're kind of at the same place in the states that we were at the federal level maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. For sure, all of the attention, all of the public interest tech attention was at the federal level, I think because of healthcare.gov in part. Like, it was clear that there was a crisis there, and that needed to be solved. And so I think that a lot of focus was there, but as we continue to see, policymakers still feel like are still sort of under the impression that there is a turnkey way to just make it so. And you just say what you want, and then then it happens. Then the states just do their magic and make it happen. And we're going deep on a project right now where I won't say what the county is, but a very, very large county, in order to stand up a mandated program, hired a contractor and had them purchase a GoDaddy account and invoice for it rather than procure. We talked to states where 200 different municipalities all use the same vendor to stand up instances of the same thing, 200. If you're a tech person, that makes your ears bleed a little bit, that there are 200 instances of anything. So I think that I think we're kind of playing catch up a little bit. We're very behind. There's no sugarcoating it. We're very behind. We're very behind where we should be. I don't think I think part of it is neglect, but I think that part of it is who knew this was where we were going to be, and this was where the world was going to be. And we're trying to solve a really hard problem that nobody has solved. Nobody knows how a federation of 50 states works together to produce digital products. We're figuring that out. So yes, I think for sure the states are lagging behind. That is a huge problem. There are definitely places where states there are places where cities and municipalities have done amazing things. Glendale, Arizona, shout out to Glendale, Arizona, who they have an office of performance management. They are completely data driven. Everything that they do, that they put out, they can see how it goes. They can see where things get stuck. They have metrics for everything. They optimize every process. That's one good example. Let's say they're at the forefront maybe 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now. At least there's a model. At least there's something that states and municipalities can start to look at and say, oh, maybe we should do that.
And I know that I sort of jumped in the middle of one of the other questions. Hannah, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to note regarding the current administration, the current iteration of leaders that are coming in. And do you feel like they are taking this notion of delivery, as we like to say, delivery being the strategy?
I think that to the extent that, as much delivery, lived experience with delivery as you could hope for, this administration has. These are people who are either lived through healthcare.gov and came back, or at least experienced it, as a private citizen, and understand that technology and delivery go hand in hand with making policy. From knowing to doing, as we just talked about, making the wheels turn in government is very tough and very slow. So I think we now have to make up the distance between knowing and what that looks like in operation.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to another question from our book club, which I love how concise it is, in that it gets really to a heart of a problem that a lot of us talk about. So how do you convince tech, IT, government employees, people in government who might have been in their role for 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years, that public interest tech, that these ways of working is the way forward? And Tara, I'll kick it off to you for that.
I think sometimes there's convincing, and sometimes there's creating the space to let a good idea that someone else killed a decade ago emerge. I think I had a really humbling experience in my career in the Office of management and budget, where I, did what you do as a political appointee. I come to some senior staff meeting. I share a deck about making the federal government work for communities in crisis. And afterwards, a career official pulled me aside and said, would you like to see the version of this deck that the Bush administration presented about how to make the government work for cities and states? And I said, like, certainly, and one, that person raised their hand. Two, I said, let's go explore. And you can see, it might not be that your new idea is so new. It might be that you didn't learn from the barriers of why it didn't work last time. So I think sometimes really having big ears with career leaders, whether at the technical side or program side, and again, making that potential march through the lived experience accessible to everyone. I think it's really rare. No one goes into public service to be rich or famous. It's everyone came really from a purpose. And so, but often the more senior you get, the longer you are, the farther away you get from the frontline workers, the farther away you get from seeing someone. You may have been a social worker and now you're an agency head. And so really trying to create that feedback loop. And it does take some breaking down barriers. The Partnership for Public Service used to run a training in 2013 that allowed senior executive service members to go to the field and to walk in a public health clinic that they send $1 billion to across the country. And it was so refreshing and returned people to their purpose and made you want to go fight the battle. So I'd say two kind of pointed pieces of advice. One, listen first, and create the space for people to share what doesn't work. And second, really returning to first purposes, getting, most senior folks to walk in the shoes of those on the front line often surfaces things people can't look away from on the fixing side.
I think the other thing that I will add to that is that leadership matters and it makes a difference. And time and again, we see that municipalities, places where there's strong leadership that says, we're going to do this because this is the right thing to do. And these are the people that we need to serve and we're going to serve them. And I don't care about, crossing the I's and dotting the T's and I will cover you. Those are the places where change happens. Those are the places where, I don't know who's leading Glendale, Arizona, but probably a decent person, probably somebody who's a true believer.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been, excuse me, I have been personally thinking about one of the interesting facets of leadership in government and a problem with it, which is 100% agreed. A lot of it starts with leadership and a lot of it is, very focused on, and this is something that we knew at the US Digital Service and other places in government all know this in their bones, that if you don't have leadership buy-in, it's going to be much harder. At the same time, we are seeing a substantial trend of very high turnover in leadership positions in government. Even just as an anecdotal example, I worked at the Department of Homeland Security along with Hannah, and we had 7 different CIOs in 1 year. And it is, that is a high number, yes, but it is not uncommon for that kind of high turnover to exist in different places. And I'm curious what the two of you might think of as ways to both acknowledge that leadership is necessary to move these sorts of things forward, to bring this new way of working, these new ways of thinking and prioritizing the work that we do and of serving the public to the forefront, while also recognizing the fact that, the leader that we might be building up a lot of knowledge with and a lot of buy-in with could be gone tomorrow and replaced by someone still, effective, but still new. And just wondering if you have any thoughts on that front.
So can you kind of restate what the question, how do we solve for that? Or
yeah, exactly. How do we solve for the fact that leadership is necessary and getting leaders to come into the public interest tech space and the ways of working is necessary, and yet we're seeing a trend of high leadership turnover in government?
So I think there are two pieces to that. One is the kinds of jobs, what those jobs look like. Tara and I are at a think tank that is something like 70% women. And part of the reason I think that there are and a significant number of the people who work there are parents. And these are people who all looked at potential leadership positions in government and were like, not right now, I think. And I don't think that that's unusual. I think we hear that from a lot of places. And so that is part of the problem that just the world is wrestling with, which is like, how do you actually create places that parents want to work at, or that people want to work at and have a life that is beyond work, especially, as coming through the pandemic. I think obviously a lot of people are questioning that. So I think some of that is just government needs a rethink as much as the private sector needs a rethink as to what work looks like. And probably, again, harder to do in a place where all of those are, where what work looks like is rigidly bound by laws. The other issue, the other question is like, who is coming into the pipeline? And we certainly work on that at New America. We have a university network where we are really rethinking how, partnering with universities to rethink how we train our leaders. And we have created public interest technology, funded public interest technology labs at different universities, 43 universities. And they offer a combination of tech skills for policy people and policy skills for tech people. So an idea that you could be a computer science major and go and work in government. You don't have to work in Facebook. So some piece of that, I think, is, we hope one piece of that is that those people have the skills that they need to govern today. So, which is a very roundabout way of saying maybe some of the leadership is changing so frequently because there's a real skills gap. And as things become more digital and as tech becomes more essential to serving people, maybe there really does need to be some turnover as we get people who are more trained.
Tara, anything that you want to add in on that note?
Just at a high level, like, that's a problem that needs to be fixed unto itself. It's its own project, right? I think Hannah got to kind of the underpinnings, but
Yeah.
also in the leadership can come from anywhere. And in the book, we talk about kind of rudimentary top down and bottom up, and very frequently an amazing deputy who's not going anywhere, who keeps the process going and doesn't put it on ice for 6 months. I think so many of our stories took a combination of government who gives, governor who gives air cover, and person in office who's just like, I raise my hand, let's try it first here. This thing we're doing isn't working. And so, I think the Partnership for Public Service really does as much as anyone to raise the dignity of what it's like to be, how hard it is to be a public servant. So I don't want to make light of maybe very good reasons for each of those transitions. We have to make it not so. We need to not persecute our public servants. We need to do what you guys do, hold some awards. But on the flip side, I don't want to leave it hanging out there that leadership only comes from the top. And I do hope that anyone who's listening in and is thinking like, could I start this? Yes, wherever you are, any part of the team, you can get it going.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's actually a question that we have from our book club that really gets at this point. And I'll quote, "The book highlights a model of distributed responsibility where frontline staff have ownership over policy design and implementation. However, what prevents a diffusion of responsibility?" This is the question that they pose. What prevents a diffusion of responsibility, particularly when multiple levels of government are involved? I know that you've touched on some of this already, but we'll just be curious to hear your thoughts on that. What prevents a diffusion of responsibility?
I do think we're sort of designed to diffuse responsibility, which on the one hand is like, which is problematic because in the end, the no one, so frequently the structure has no buck stopping at like, how's it going for our customers? Like, that's just, it's not that people are ill-willed. That's like not generally, I can say like maybe Hughes had like a new version of this. There are some places where there's a new customer service role. I don't want to undercut that there are some of these, but generally speaking, like, hey, I wake up and I run the call center. I run the policy. I run the website. Like, it's not my job to make it work for someone. It's my job to keep the website up. It's my job to keep the call center up. It's like, and the space that the humans touch is across the three when it's your grandma who's like found any email address and any person and feels like no one can see me. And so some of it is just kind of not the diffusion of responsibility, especially to the public, is a real, I think, structural challenge to getting big things fixed fast. On the other hand, it does mean that kind of anywhere you are in the line, if you so nominate yourself, you have an opportunity to kind of make a change. But often it means like for you to really do that, you got to like call the gal who runs the call center, and that's outside your job description, and talking to the website person's outside hers. So we it was built for a different time for a different purpose. I think my former colleague Jack is on here in a time when like horse and buggies and maritime travel was like cutting edge technology. So we're going to have to re-engineer the structures, some of which diffuse responsibility, but some of also which diffuse responsiveness to the public.
Anna, any notes to add on that front? All right. Well, then I have a question from the audience that I want to make sure to get to. And I'll quote from the question here. One of the greatest challenges I see in this space, again, the audience member, I see in this space is two intersecting trends. A ton of incentive and administrative barrier to keep public servants from actually engaging with the public. This is something you just mentioned. And a long-term desire to submerge government services such that they are invisible or not seen as public services in nature. Do you have any success stories or tips on how to combat these two elements, and particularly the first element? Maybe Hannah, we'll start with you.
Sorry, what was the first element?
The first element was lots of incentives and administrative barriers that keep public servants from engaging with the public.
Charles, I'll pass it to you. I need to mull.
I think it's real. I think the promotion structure is such that if you want to rise and become a senior executive service member, you get farther and farther. So I would foot stomp the kind of presumption in the question that, in any time, and it's well-meaning, anytime you want to revisit the way we demographically identify the buckets that are race in America that have changed over the past 10 years, you need to run a paperwork. You don't have to. I would say it's a de minimis change, but like your DC may feel you have to run a paperwork reduction act project that's months long, to use a word that's no longer appropriate for checkbox of what you are. So like we are the kind of, I want to foot stomp that the administrative barriers to what seem totally intuitive in 2021 are real. So for folks who are like, this is hard, yes. On the flip side, Hannah and I make a strong case in the book that there is no solving the world's hardest problems without governments that work. And I think there are counter cases out there that suggest like an app can fix something. And like, we don't believe that. We need governments that work and are modern. And to the second part of the question, we're kind of submerging the existence of government because it's kind of a bad brand at this point in time, for better or for worse. It's not a bad brand with me, but that's a statistically true fact in the United States of America. In the US and around the world, the term government has got a drag. And if you put government in the lead of it, it drags your government childcare, government drags your thing down. And so the temptation to knock government out, as the Kennedy Center of Government has done in the title of their school, means we are not, when, helping with the government works. So I think like to the second part of this, we're going to need to own these as government services. On the flip side, if you want people to think government works, they need to have had one experience in their life where it really works, whether that's, paying a parking ticket or the DMV or paying taxes. And so I think, we're going to have to take head on the fixing the government works by being more candid about this being a government service. I will share one personal example of this from healthcare. There is something called the Kentucky Connect. Do you know what that is? The Kentucky face of healthcare.gov. It was crazy popular. People liked it. It was government healthcare purchased, private sector healthcare purchased through a marketplace exchange. And they branded it appropriately. They did research and they saw that Kentuckians weren't going to be here for that. But you know what then hurt? When people were trying to take away healthcare, people did not associate Kentucky Connect with the takeaway. And so the defense became harder. So just to be really specific about this, until we're honest about where the government shows up and go out of our way to be like, hey, you like that GPS thing? Brought to you by the federal government research projects. Like until we really take on the project of explaining what you have that you like, the government works, and not kind of submerge it, I don't think we're going to change the kind of framework we're in. And that is it's a tricky piece of business. So I appreciate the question. I kind of affirm the two component parts, but I think it is a real body of work we need to do for people who care about government work.
And on the second point, it's such a fascinating topic. I think be a great dissertation. Like, when did government services feel like they needed to become invisible? Because of course there was a point in time when government services were so limited that they were completely visible and celebrated. You think about the post office, right? Which was like really, in some ways, well, aside from the Army, the first government service, and people were really proud of it. It was a real achievement. And I think we're in a weird moment where, first of all, government services sometimes are so complex that, like, who even knows that you got them, right? The healthcare.gov is a healthcare example, is a great example. Roads, water, like things are just there and we're used to them and we take them for granted. There is a real problem in government, and Mark, I know you've heard me talk about this, but there is a real problem with the government's relationship to the media. And government is very afraid of being in the press, period, end of story, for anything. It's not a question of like, oh, hey, we have a good story to tell you. Like, it's just, we don't want to talk about it at all, period. And I think that government has gotten so used to that and so used to just being so protective over what gets told that it's been to their detriment. It's been to the detriment of like that there are actually good, positive stories out there and they don't get told either.
Absolutely. And that actually gets to a sort of meta question that I had had in my back pocket that I wanted to ask you, which is the writing style in the book. It very much so is story driven, right? You have what some people might call case studies. I love to just it's stories, right? You're telling the story of government project after government project, instance after instance. And I'm curious to just ask, what was the sort of desire of finding these stories and telling those stories as the core tool, as opposed to just sort of bringing the ideas forward themselves?
Kind of started with the stories, I think. Like, this book really grew out of that. We had a number of great stories to tell, and there was an obvious way to connect them. But in part, I think my work at New America certainly was, let's find the good stories and tell them and see if there's an appetite for that. And there was. It turns out people actually really like to hear stories about there was this problem and then it got solved in this really smart way. People will read that. People love that. We're just not telling those stories. We're not telling them. So I think some of it was just, and we say this over and over, like the goal, one of the major goals of this book was to make the work visible. This is work that is largely invisible. And we want to shine a light on it. And, and frankly, like, that is what journalism should be doing. That's a topic for a different webinar. But I will say that part of the goal of the book, we started with the stories. So that's why it's story driven.
I'll certainly attend that journalism focused webinar as well. Now, I know that we've only got about 10-ish minutes left, a little bit less than actually. There's another quote that I really love in the book, and I actually had to pull my book open and get the underlined copy right here. Page 50, for those of you following. The plan was not to terrify anyone, to be reassuring, and to move softly. And the reason that I bring that quote up is that the work that this sort of field does, when we talk about tech, a lot of people think of the famous quote, move fast and break things. And you bring up this story and this particular quote in the book that I love because it's very much so focused on this is different style of work. And as people who have observed folks moving from the private sector to the public, how do you view that sort of that shift that people tend to make where, again, we've talked about this a little bit, but the private sector, yes, we're trying to bring in some of those ways of working like customer experience or like, using technology and using data to make decisions, but we're not trying to bring that ethos, right? And so how do folks make that transition, and how do we keep the public sector leaders and the public sector sort of civil servants, getting them on board with it without having that bad taste in their mouth of like, oh, but these are just people that are going to move fast and break things?
I think that generally, no matter what sector you're in, there is some fatigue with moving fast and breaking things. I think there are a lot of broken things and that we can attribute to the private sector and to that ethos. And certainly there was a period of time when both the public and the private sector embraced that as like, let's find the next whiz kid and bring them in and just like, let them have at it. And that's the way to fix everything. And just a personal anecdote, I was a part of, in the private sector, there was no company that didn't try to do this, to like have their little innovation lab. And I did some consulting with ADP, which you probably get your paychecks from ADP. They pay something like 70% of the world pays through ADP. And they decided they were going to compete with Google. And they were going to create this innovation lab. It was in like a secret door in Midtown Manhattan, and there was like free food everywhere. And they had like everything catered in, and big surprise, it didn't work. It didn't work. ADP was still going to be as bureaucratic as ADP was ever going to be. And just because they had an innovation team that was like, had, hoteling at desks and had all the gummy bears they wanted, wasn't going to change that. So I think that there is some piece of that is just a learning process. Certainly as a society, we are obsessed with whiz kids in general. We want there to be just like a magic wand and someone to come in and wave it and fix all of the problems. We collectively as a society have had to relearn, sadly, again, that is not the way to solve problems. There's no magic wand when it comes to solving problems, especially public sector problems. So I think that in some ways, this is a reaction to like, actually don't move fast and break things, go really slowly and quietly, tiptoe, and like wrap everything in bubble wrap. Probably somewhere in the middle is the right, like, I think some of it is also just the challenge of how do you channel being an innovator and, being a out of the box thinker while also working within a really bureaucratic structure. That's stuff that we've had to learn as a field, and I think we're still learning.
I went out of our way in the book, Mark, which our beloved book club at PBS will know, to recognize that while a lot of these practices, improvement processes, were kind of perfected in the crucible of where the country's economy meets Silicon Valley, some of them, like many of them, predate that which is the tech world, right? Like good qualitative research comes from like anthropological traditions, and isn't human-centered design is like the newest version, variant of that, and similarly, like a lot of the improvement processes that go back to Deming's, yes, a technologist, an engineer, but also like not from the West Coast. So we really try to broaden out the history of some of the practices and show it isn't just a like import lean methods piece, and in that spirit, create space for kind of a broader set of origin stories of the tools. And frankly, even a really American origin story. We tell the story in the book about President Lincoln, Like that this isn't like a new thing from a culture you don't know about who brought you your iPhone. This is like ours. President Lincoln had this is like small d democratic idea that you would fling open the doors of the White House to the great chagrin of your advisors. And then after months of wrestling, agree that you won't do it like 3 days a week. You'll do it 2 days a week. President Lincoln opened the doors to the White House. He let anyone come in, petition him. Often it was politicians, but sometimes it was, random taxpayers and widowers. And it is a culture that isn't like a new thing. This is ours, but we got to make it new because we are 31% bigger than we were in Lincoln's time. And we have new tools to be able to listen without literally creating a line in front of the White House. So I think part of what we aim to do is kind of broaden out what these practices are and who brought them to us, but also show that it isn't simply like a tech tradition. It's kind of embedded in our we the people part of our origin story.
I absolutely love that, and it kind of hits on a little element of this final question from the audience that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. So in government, there's often a fear and often a greater fear of taking a personal hit for a sort of transformational risk, like doing one of these things and the risk coming to life, rather than over the fear of doing nothing, right? People are more afraid of doing something transformational than they are of doing nothing. Now, some of that might be personnel, but this audience member says that they think that it might also have to do with oversight and therefore leadership in other ways. What do you think good oversight looks like for true innovation in government? Now, of course, you only have 2 minutes to answer this big question, so I'm just going to go ahead and let you take as much time as you need. Tara, maybe you can kick us off.
Code for America built a dashboard for the child tax credit work that they did. It's totally public. Shows in real time how many people use their tool to get the child tax credit, how long it took them. I think in some ways, if we do the job of delivering in government at the federal level better, it changes the oversight game. Right now, I testified in front of the Senate Finance Committee when the House and Senate were worried about how the Social Security Agency was doing during COVID. It is one of the few agencies that serve fewer people in emergency services in a time when people needed them more. They're a bricks and mortar place. How did they do oversight? They sent a letter asking for data. They sent back another letter. If you had a real-time dashboard on some basic functions about how you deliver, you could save a lot of letters. You could have an API that redirects and allows people to analyze data on the Hill in their own way. So I think in some ways, the ability to do oversight will hopefully change as we increase kind of our ability to demonstrate to the public in real time what a wait time is for certain benefits. And so, I think there's a vision, I point to Code for America, like that there's no reason what they built couldn't happen in real time for anything from health insurance open enrollment period, where are we, 8, to, Social Security signups. And I think that will change the nature of it and make, moving the staff time to being less like answer my question in a letter and more like, gosh, we're all looking at this data. What does it tell us? What's popping? How can we better analyze it and use it to solve problems, not spend all our time muscling just to gather it?
I'll just add on to that I think there's a goals issue. So it's like, what is your goal at the end of the day? Is to serve people. It's not necessarily keeping that in mind. With leadership is a route.
Well, as we are at 6 o'clock, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and specifically to Tara, Hannah, and Mark for engaging us in this imperative conversation. I particularly appreciated the call to return to purpose. I think that's a takeaway that's salient for a world-wearied career government employee or a new partnership staff member like myself. For those interested in purchasing a copy of Power to the Public for themselves or as an end-of-year manual manifesto for the budding public interest technologists in your life, Tara and Hannah have generously extended a discount code, which you can find in the chat. We at the partnership would like to wish you a happy end of 2021 and hope to see you at subsequent author talk events in 2022, though this one will be incredibly hard to top. Thank you.